So who were the ancient Egyptians? I mean, really. It's a question that has sparked debate for centuries. Were they Middle Eastern? Mediterranean? Today, we're going to dig into a source that argues for a totally different answer, one that's rooted not in the north or the east, but right there on the continent of Africa itself. Let's see what the evidence has to say.
So let's just dive right in, shall we? Who were the ancient Egyptians? Now, the answer you usually hear places them in a sort of Mediterranean or Middle Eastern world. But the source material we're looking at today, it builds its case from a completely different starting point.
So, our investigation is going to start by sifting through the hard evidence, the physical and scientific stuff. We're going to look at what the bones, the mummies, and even the blood of the ancient Egyptians can tell us, all according to the research laid out in our source.
Now, you'd think that looking at skeletons would give you a pretty straightforward answer, right? But early on, it really wasn't that simple. The source describes a lot of what it calls scientific hair splitting, Different researchers were using their own arbitrary criteria, which led to all these classifications that were, frankly, confusing and often contradicted each other.
And here's a perfect example of what they were doing. Researchers would take these super precise measurements of the face and nose, what they called the facial index and the nasal index, to try and classify skulls. They were trying to create these neat, objective categories, but as the source points out, the metrics themselves could be pretty arbitrary and just led to a ton of debate.
But here's the crucial part. According to our source, even with all the different methods, all the debates, and the hair splitting, these early anthropological studies kept pointing toward the exact same conclusion. When you put all the data together, it showed that the foundational population of Egypt, way back in the pre-dynastic era, was black.
Okay, so let's move on to something a bit more modern, a more direct piece of evidence that's talked about in the source, the melanin dosage test. And this is a huge deal, because instead of just measuring bones, this lab method lets scientists directly measure the amount of melanin, the actual pigment that determines skin color, in tiny samples of mummified skin.
And this isn't just some theory, it comes directly from microscopic analysis of skin that was actually taken from mummies. As you can see from the source text here, scientists can analyze these ancient samples right in the lab. And the key thing is, melanin, that pigment in our skin, it's incredibly stable. It can be measured accurately even after thousands of years.
So, what did the test find? Well, the conclusion, as stated right here in the source, is completely unambiguous. The author rates that based on the levels of melanin they found, it enables us to classify the ancient Egyptians unquestionably among the black races. That is a very powerful, very direct statement based on hard science. But the biological evidence doesn't stop there. Let's talk about blood groups. The source points out this really fascinating link. Both modern Egyptians in Upper Egypt and West Africans share a high frequency of blood group B. And this is pretty significant because, according to the source, it's different from blood group A2, which was more characteristic of historical European populations.
All right, let's switch gears and build on this. We're stepping out of the lab and turning to history itself. I mean, what did the people who actually saw the ancient Egyptians with their own eyes have to say about them? Let's look at the testimony of the classical writers. First up, we've got Herodotus, the guy they call the father of history. Back in the 5th century BCE, he made this observation, not as part of some big debate, but just as a matter-of-fact statement. He directly describes the Egyptians with two key physical traits, black-skinned and kinky-haired.
And it wasn't just Herodotus. Fast forward about 400 years, and you've got the Greek writer Apollodorus. He tells a story about the country's founding. And what does he call the native people? The black-footed ones. It's another clear reference to their appearance.
And this description just keeps popping up even well into the Roman era. In the 4th century of our era, the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus wrote about the people he saw, describing the men of Egypt as being mostly brown or black. I mean, that's remarkable consistency over nearly 1,000 years. Okay, now let's do a massive time jump, all the way to 1783. A French scholar named Constantin Volney is visiting Egypt. He's looking at the Great Sphinx, and he writes that its features are characteristically Negro, and that seeing it immediately made him think of that old passage from Herodotus. It's an incredible moment that connects the ancient texts directly to the monuments themselves. So, we've looked at the physical anthropology, and we've heard from ancient eyewitnesses. But the source argues that the connections go even deeper than appearance. Let's explore that third line of evidence, the cultural and linguistic links that tie ancient Egypt to the rest of the African continent. One really powerful example is circumcision.
The source notes that even Herodotus identified the practice as being of African origin. But here's the thing. Archaeology backs this up completely. Mummies show that circumcision was the rule for Egyptians as far back as we can see, way into the protohistoric era, before 4000 BCE.
And then there's the language. This, to me, is where it gets really compelling. The source shows this striking comparison between words in ancient Egyptian and Wolof, which is a language spoken in Senegal today. I mean, look at that. Core verbs like to grasp and to love are almost identical. That's way more than just a coincidence. That points to a deep historical relationship.
So, let's step back for a second. After looking at the physical, the historical, and the cultural evidence laid out in this source, what's the big picture? Well, it all seems to be pointing toward a new perspective, one that's all about reconnecting Egypt firmly to its African roots. See, the source argues that no single piece of this stands alone. Instead, it's about these converging lines of evidence. You've got the physical anthropology, the lab analysis of melanin in blood, the testimony of ancient writers, and the cultural and linguistic kinship, and they're all pointing in the same direction.
So when you weave all these different threads together, the skeletal remains, the melanin tests, those eyewitness accounts, the deep cultural and language ties, the source presents a really powerful conclusion. That ancient Egypt wasn't some kind of Mediterranean or Middle Eastern outlier, but a civilization that was fundamentally and deeply rooted in its native African context.
And that leaves us with a final, really important question. If we accept the evidence that's presented here, how does placing ancient Egypt squarely within the history of Africa change our understanding of world history, of culture, of civilization itself? It's a profound thought, and one worth exploring.